Hi, I'm Joan Braune, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share this paper with you and with the Fromm Society. I am a faculty member at Gonzaga University, which is in Spokane, Washington, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And I was asked to contribute a paper a couple of years ago to a edited issue of a journal. The journal is Environment and Planning C. It's a geography journal for a special issue on the Frankfurt School and Place or Space. And it took me a while to come up with a topic, and I decided to return to a theme I had thought about some time back, almost maybe 10 years ago. I wrote a chapter for a collected volume on psychoanalysis and radical politics, where I looked at Erich Fromm's relationship with Katherine Dunham, which is a somewhat under-investigated, I would say very under-investigated, underwritten about area of Fromm's life. And I'm happy to share this paper with you. It's currently under review with that journal. So I'd love some feedback. And yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this paper. And I will just read. And you should also be getting a copy of this as an attachment. The paper is called Leaving Home, Erich Fromm, Katherine Dunham, and Unfolding Humanism. In considerations of the Frankfurt School and Place, the theme of this special issue of the journal, no doubt one would attempt to attend much to the Frankfurt School thinkers' experience of exile and diaspora as German Jews displaced by Nazism. These were not thinkers bound irrevocably to the local, but travelers and internationalists, both by tragic circumstance and by chosen affiliation. They were inheritors of a Marxist intellectual tradition, emphasizing a universal humanity and an international working class. In addition to Marxist internationalism, they were partly inheritors of what might be called a Jewish internationalism. Although the views of particular members of the Frankfurt School on Zionism and the Israeli state project differed, with Erich Fromm being the fiercest opponent of Zionism, Frankfurt School thinkers of Max Horkheimer's generation were familiar with ideas such as neo-Kantian philosopher Hermann Cohen's monotheist idea, according to which Jews were the inheritors and spreaders of an idea of universal siblinghood through diasporic mobility, and thus possessed an international socialist mission. Despite the Frankfurt School's border crossing, both by political choice and coerced due to anti-Semitic persecution, the Frankfurt School's story has been primarily told as a European and North American story. What would it mean to, in the words of the Caribbean Philosophical Association, shift the geography of reason with regard to the Frankfurt School? Could the work of the Frankfurt School give way to something truly international in its humanism, not rejecting place, but crossing borders and embracing manyness in its experience of location? To experiment in this direction, this article explores the friendship between Frankfurt School critical theorist Erich Fromm and Black anthropologist and dancer Katherine Dunham, and the parallels between their thought, especially on the topic of humanism. Without knowing exactly where further investigation of this connection will lead future scholarship, I offer an exploratory look at the parallels between the two thinkers, while further work will remain to situate each within their contemporary debates and the continuation of these conversations today, especially concerning unity within difference and the respective role of particular identities within struggles for universal emancipation. From the work of the Caribbean Philosophical Network on creolizing to the unfolding developments in non-Eurocentric humanistic theory, many have explored theoretically the ways in which humanism can be done from below, or with attention to the particularity of identity. But the dialogue between Fromm's and Dunham's humanism has yet to occur. Fromm was a German Jewish scholar and Frankfurt School critical theorist, joining the Frankfurt School in 1930 under Max Horkheimer, before both Marcuse and Adorno. Fromm was a Marxist philosopher and socialist movement organizer, Freudian psychoanalyst, and deeply influenced by Jewish philosophy, among other traditions, including later in life Zen Buddhism. The African-American scholar Katherine Dunham was a pioneering anthropologist, dancer, choreographer, educator, and activist. At the cutting edge of contemporary anthropological research, Dunham pushed the boundaries of anthropological participant observation through undergoing initiation into voodoo in Haiti, generating new thinking about the relationship between theory and practice in social scientific research. In this article, I argue that similar insights and similar humanistic commitments are found in both thinkers. I address how each thinker balanced an overriding commitment to a philosophy of universalistic humanism alongside the particularity of communities. For example, Senegalese president and negritude thinker Leopold Sédar Senghor intersects the lives of both thinkers and their humanistic commitments. In the following, I begin with a brief introduction on Fromm's and Dunham's lives and relationship. I then explore a common thread in each, the need to leave home and embrace a more expansive world. Each spoke of the liberating power of travel for the individual and the theorist, and each saw a radical experience of encounter with universal humanity as possible in theory and experiential practice. I then devote separate sections, first to Fromm's humanism and then to Dunham's humanism, with each thinker emphasizing different aspects of humanism, but the parallels between the two arising as apparent, in particular at the intersection of their defense of humanism with radical politics. In the section on Fromm's humanism, I explore his concept of the being orientation and a dialectic of leaving home and finding a new home in the wider world. In the section on Dunham's humanism, I explore how humanism shows up in her politics, pedagogy, philosophy of dance, and anthropological ethics of discomfort. This article dances between and interweaves the contextual work of biography and history with the larger philosophical questions to which each thinker speaks through their dialectic of locatedness and partial transcendence of location. Reading Fromm and Dunham together and treating their embodied experience as text alongside their theoretical contributions offers creative possibility and hope. It is humanism more in the sense of the embodied faith in the unfolding of this human potential, rather than a purely analytical category that we may see here. In exploring Fromm and Dunham together, we see how each makes a humanistic challenge within diasporic life, and each defends leaving home. In undertaking this inquiry, we are engaged in the exploration and work of creolizing, and thus within a tradition that celebrates the fruitfulness of dialogue and merging between disparate cultures, especially including within the African diaspora. Particularly relevant here seems to be Michael Monahan's reflection in the creolizing subject, to the effect that, quote, the creolizing subject openly affirms and celebrates humanity as an ongoing and open process, end quote. We see this openness to human process and unfolding as connecting with the humanism of both Dunham and Fromm. Crucial to the humanism of both Dunham and Fromm was the wider spatial world as a site of possibility and thus of hope, a hope founded partly in the possibility that one may find ways to leave, can go elsewhere against the odds, opens up new ways of being human. Rather than simply a confrontation with otherness or a meeting of more of the same, one encounters a dialectical unity of sameness and otherness. This hope is found in productiveness and aliveness, in the whole person, rational, embodied, connected, and in community. Dunham's humanism is expressed both in her theory and practice of dance, as well as in her dance pedagogy, in her politics, and in her research method. Fromm's humanism is expressed in his theory of human nature, his clinical work, his activism, and his philosophy of education and social change. Fromm and Dunham, Diasporas and Leaving Home. It is difficult to discern the nature of Fromm's and Dunham's relationship, and more research is needed to uncover the full significance of each thinker within the biography of the other. It is a mark, perhaps, of the limitations imposed by the specialization of knowledge and academic disciplinary boundaries, which in turn serve to uphold Eurocentric narratives, that Dunham is rarely mentioned in discussions of Fromm's life and work. There are a few exceptions. Mainly, Dunham is mentioned in Rainer Funk's biography, Erich Fromm, His Life and Ideas, an Illustrated Biography, as a figure with whom Fromm's closeness may have led to the end of a prior relationship with fellow humanistic psychoanalyst Kieran Horney. Funk points out that later Fromm was close to another famous dancer, Martha Graham. In his biography, The Lives of Erich Fromm Loves Profit, Lawrence Friedman suggests that Fromm had a relationship or affair with Dunham for a few years in the late 1930s, around the same time or concurrent with his relationship with Kieran Horney. According to Dunham, as quoted in an interview in the Los Angeles Times, we, Fromm and Dunham, were very much in love. She was also clear that Fromm refused to analyze her, indicating that the boundaries between the two of them were more intimate than those of analyst and patient. Fromm also offered Dunham a mythological image that she carried with her and which appears in a number of her works, a comparison of Dunham with the Greek mythological figure Iphigenia. The image became important to Dunham, who referenced it in various interviews and publications. The story of Iphigenia's agency, pulled in different directions by demands to sacrifice herself to her father and to her brother, seems to have spoken to Dunham, who struggled both with her father's abuse and the desire to help her brother, who's a famous philosopher, in his struggle with mental illness. A reference in a 1962 speech by Fromm may also provide a clue to the meaning. Fromm references both the classic play by Euripides and the later adaptation of the Iphigenia myth by Goethe. In the former, Iphigenia must escape her home to avoid being sacrificed to the gods, convinces the king of a foreign country not to kill her for being a foreigner, and eventually returns home with the help of her brother. In the play by Goethe, Iphigenia wins the favor of the foreign king for herself and her brother by giving a speech about humanism, in which she urges the king to consider that, quote, the voice of truth and humanity is heard by everyone, born beneath whatever clime, within whose bosom flows the streams of life. Here she is presented by Goethe and Fromm as an icon of humanism. As is often the case in Fromm's political, prophetic, and psychoanalytic work, Fromm's image poses an alternative. Iphigenia may succumb to the sacrifice of self that is initially demanded by both her father and the foreign king, both of whom have a political policy that requires murdering her, or she may choose to escape home and the confines of political oppression, becoming a voice for humanism and freedom. Dunham herself had to escape both her sexually abusive father, as detailed in her childhood memoir, A Touch of Innocence, and to whatever extent possible, the varying strictures of racism and sexism confining her potential within American society. A Touch of Innocence discusses Dunham's childhood experiences with violence, including the sense of danger and threat she experienced in Chicago, and the sense of liberation and hope Dunham found by connecting with Caribbean negritude. The element of choice in the Iphigenia image echoes the crucial concept of alternatives in Fromm's thought. According to Fromm, the Hebrew prophets did not predict the future, but rather posed the public the fundamental alternatives faced by their society, not forcing them, but allowing them to choose for themselves. Fromm sees various historical and contemporary figures as playing this prophet role, such as Rosa Luxemburg, with her call for the masses to choose between socialism and barbarism. Fromm also locates Marx within this prophetic tradition. Within his philosophy of human nature, Fromm's alternativism posits that freedom of the will is neither unlimited nor non-existent. Rather, one's freedom of will is contingent upon making certain fundamental choices correctly, and upon the malleability of one's character and one's awareness of the options and likely consequences of each choice. Making certain choices incorrectly may lead to a lack of freedom later, while choosing correctly may lead to the further expansion of one's freedom. Given the ubiquity of this theme across Fromm's theory and practice, it is unsurprising he offered Dunham the image of Iphigenia, and would likely have conveyed its alternativist character. Some later letters between Fromm and Dunham in the 1960s were made available to me thanks to Rainer Funk and the Erich Fromm Archive. These were written during the period that Fromm was living in Mexico, after the possible romance between Fromm and Dunham. There are, however, some rather nice lines that resonate with our inquiry here. For example, in 1964, Fromm writes, "One must always be completely realistic and not be seduced by a sense of pride or energy and hope. I deeply believe in the Buddhist principle that one should try, however far one gets in this, not to be compulsively attached to any aim, but live in such a way that one is completely open to the world, but without fear of losing something, because one has nothing to lose." Some of the letters enclosed Dunham's creative projects. Some discuss her travels and contacts, and some reference her struggles with depression. Dunham adopts an appreciative, fawning or fan demeanor towards Fromm at times, calling him my guru. At other times seems flirtatious. At other times leaning on him for therapeutic expertise to whatever extent he's willing to offer it, including seeking help obtaining prescription medications for depression. At other times exchanging ideas, and at other times simply coordinating and arranging professional activities. How much of her demeanor in the correspondence is simply a strategic modus operandi of a brilliant woman of color seeking to make connections, or how much reflects her own insecurity, admiration for Fromm, or perhaps unrequited love, is difficult to say, and impossible for me to detect as an outsider from the data available, and made harder to discern, no doubt, by my removed context as a white woman living 80 years after these letters were written. Additionally, the apparent absence of part of the correspondence from the archive makes it difficult to analyze. I have speculated elsewhere on Dunham's influence on Fromm, his understanding of the relationship between theory and practice, heavily influenced by German idealism and Marxist historical materialism, which is challenged in its breadth through Dunham's revolutionary approach to participant observation in anthropology. However, the relationship between the two thinkers and degree of influence on each other can be difficult to discern. Hence, I direct my focus here beyond the biographical, although the lives of each thinker, in the spirit of constitutive border crossing and synthesis explored here, are woven in and out of the discussion of their thought offered here, as neither thinker severed theory from practice. As a whole, the Frankfurt School's experience was marked by exile, the crossing of the Atlantic, and of national boundaries. Unsettled by Nazism, these scholars continued to deal with anti-Semitism in the United States and with McCarthyism. The Institute's director, Max Horkheimer, attempted to keep a tight lid on the displaced institute, forbidding participation of members in activism. The Institute would thus send their work out as a message in a bottle, flash and post, across the Atlantic, to be received in another time and place, This lack of public engagement in the United States proved suffocating to Fromm and precipitated his break from the Institute. A decade before his arrival in America, Fromm had rejected Zionism that he'd briefly embraced in his youth and began to see it as akin to the nationalism that had manifested in World War I. Seeing Marxism and the prophetic tradition of Judaism as opening to a new cosmopolitanism, he positioned his humanism against all forms of nationalism. Fromm felt increasingly confined by the Institute for Social Research while living in the United States, and perhaps especially with the leadership style of Institute Director Max Horkheimer, who had, following Carl Grunberg, referred to a dictatorship of the director over the Institute. As some members buried themselves in the war effort in the OSS, the nascent CIA, and subsequently took up research on anti-Semitism and right-wing extremism with grant money from centrist Jewish institutions, Fromm took the path of public philosopher and activist, including eventually activism through such organizations as the anti-nuclear weapons group SANE, named after Fromm's book, The Sane Society, and the Socialist Party USA, for which he wrote the important proposed document, Let Man Prevail, a Socialist Manifesto and Program. Fromm's first major publication following his break with the Institute was his best-selling Escape from Freedom, an analysis of the ways in which capitalism gives rise to impulses towards authoritarianism and fascism. In his historical account of the collapse of feudalism and the rise of Renaissance humanism, his theme of the need to leave home is already present. In the feudal medieval world, according to Fromm, quote, just as the peasant and town dweller rarely went beyond the limits of the small geographical area which was theirs, so the universe was limited and simple to understand. The earth and man were its center. Heaven or hell was the future place of life, and all actions from birth to death were transparent in their causal relation, end quote. New possibilities emerged with Renaissance humanism. Fromm writes, the result of this progressive destruction of the medieval social structure was the emergence of the individual in the modern sense. Man discovers himself and others as individuals, as separate entities. He discovers nature as something apart from himself in two aspects, as an object of theoretical and practical mastery, and in its beauty as an object of pleasure. He discovers the world, practically by discovering new continents, and spiritually by developing a cosmopolitan spirit, a spirit in which Dante can say, my country is the whole world. End quote. Fromm traveled quite a bit in his life, and in 1950, Fromm moved to Mexico, where he lived for decades, establishing a psychoanalytic institute in Mexico City and publishing a study of social character in a Mexican village. He frequently traveled back to the United States during this time and carried on a very active international correspondence, moving back to Europe, Switzerland, towards the end of his life. Fromm's life approximates the exile and homelessness discussed by Peter McLaren's description of Paulo Freire, with whom Fromm also corresponded, a crossing of literal borders as well as theoretical and disciplinary borders. In Travel and Movement in Clinical Psychology, The World Outside the Clinic, Mirage Desai writes of Fromm, comparing him to Frantz Fanon and Kieran Horney as psychotherapists engaged in travel and movement. Quote, Fromm's life was intimately tied to travel and movement. In these travels, he moved geographically, but also between the psychological and social spheres, between philosophies and religions, between cultures, and between clinical and non-traditionally clinical themes. Travel will be only more directly related to his life in adulthood, as an exile in North America, but even as a child, movement was central to his development as a critical scholar, end quote. This movement was not merely an individual choice, but also an outcome of fascism and of global conflicts, as Desai points out. It is also in the attempt to understand the conflicts, hate, and killing that gave rise to his own situation that Fromm was intellectually driven to travel in search of understanding. Crucial to Fromm's developed philosophy is the importance of leaving home. To be fully individuated, the person must leave the garden of paradise, must rebel against comforting constraints of family and tradition, and be kicked out, in some sense, like Adam and Eve, into the wider world's increased freedoms and complexity, in which the individual must build a new sense of community and home. Fromm writes far more about time than space, but it is the expansiveness of space, the refusal to be confined by the local, that most characterizes Fromm's approach to place and space. Like Fromm, who was a member of the Jewish diaspora, Dunham was likewise a member of a diaspora, the African diaspora. Further in her life, she experienced intersections of cultural background and experience, and sought out further opportunities for connection as well as distance, dancing between involvement and separateness. One might say she was both actively creolizing and from the beginning was creolized. Dunham's mother, who died when she was a young child, came from a mixed heritage that may have included white, indigenous, and African roots. Her father was a descendant of formerly enslaved Africans who had arrived in Chicago with the Great Migration from the U.S. South. From her childhood in Chicago to her time at University of Chicago with leading anthropologists, including her advisor Melville Herskovits, to Dunham's travels to Haiti, Jamaica, Senegal, Nigeria, and Morocco, and over 40 countries in her dance touring, Dunham sought a sense of global belonging that formed part of her left politics, her anti-racist activism, and her contribution to her people, including to the Black youth of East St. Louis, where she eventually led an important free school. It is difficult to express the scope of Dunham's work and influence within numerous fields. In the 1930s, Dunham's research on the anthropology of dance in the Caribbean brought her into contact with activists as well as spiritual and cultural traditions of the African diaspora associated with freedom struggles, including the tradition of the Maroons of Jamaica and of voodoo in Haiti, which famously played a role in the revolution of enslaved Blacks that liberated Haiti from French colonization and slavery. Her research in Haiti pushed the boundaries of then accepted participant observation, as she resisted her dissertation advisor Melville Herskovits' concerns and chose to be formally initiated into voodoo to understand it from the inside. Her later book publications reflected on her Caribbean experiences: Journey to Accompong, published in 1946, Dances of Haiti, published in French in 1950 and in English in 1983, and Island Possessed, published in 1969. Her ballets were performed internationally by her own dance troupe, including, among others, Lagya, which premiered in 1938, which incorporated the fighting dance of Martinique, Agya, as well as classical ballet, the anti-lynching ballad Southland, which premiered in 1951, performed despite pressure from the U.S. State Department, and Tango, which premiered in 1954, which may have been intended as a protest against Perón's government in Argentina. In addition to her books, performances, and choreography, she appeared in numerous films and published works of short fiction. Dunham needed to leave home not only in the literal sense of escaping her abusive home life and to begin her career, but she was searching for a wider community and a way to locate herself as both individuated from and connected to the world, a prominent theme in Fromm's life and psychological theory as well. Dunham's contributions to both the arts and the social sciences were extensive, rendering her larger than life and a figure who, like Fromm, crossed many disciplinary boundaries. In the next section, I explore Fromm's humanism through his philosophy, psychoanalysis, and activism. And the subsequent section on Dunham's humanism will make clear the parallels in this search for unity in difference and an expansive humanism. Fromm's humanism. The creolizing affirmation and celebration of the human process, per Michael Monahan's quote above, is expressed in Fromm's philosophy of Marxist humanism and his conception of the productive character orientation and being as opposed to having orientation. It is also expressed in his internationalist politics, as we shall see, including in his compilation of an international symposium of socialist humanist writers, among whom is included the first president of Senegal, Leopold Senghor, who was also influential on Katherine Dunham. Finally, we see in Fromm an embodied educative politics that expresses his humanistic commitment as both located and universal. Fromm's use of the term humanism, which I also apply in the discussion of Dunham, although the word is far more important to Fromm, of course is met with a variety of objections and tensions. Several scholars have offered important defenses of Fromm's humanism as a radical and emancipatory project, including Kieran Durkin, Lawrence Wilde, Kevin Anderson, and Matthias Romanetto. Part of Fromm's fall from popularity within the academy may have been due to rising skepticism about the liberating power of humanism as postmodernism and postmarxism rose in the 1980s and following the fall of the Soviet Union. However, perhaps today, amidst globally resurging fascism, which rejects the proposition of universal human worth in favor of outright supremacy, radical humanism or humanisms might also arise as new sites of hope and possibility. One of the chief concerns raised about humanism pertains to the potential for excluding some humans from its definition of humanity. This concern, of course, is not an abstract one, but is born out of the historical exclusion of people of color, women, and others by many philosophers expressing an enthusiasm for universal humanity, especially the Enlightenment and social contract thinkers who helped to birth the modern political and economic order. In a 1959 lecture, Fromm spoke of the necessity, quote, to understand other societies and cultures, from the primitive ones to the civilized ones, to understand and see, simply, other possibilities of structures and experiences, which for them were conscious, but which for us are unconscious. While his cultural expansiveness is not without limits, for example, there's an unfortunate aside in his 1941 Escape from Freedom about something being as futile as an Indian rain dance. The commitment for searching out an array of cultural phenomena to uncover the universal and unconscious forces remained consistent in Fromm's work, including his learning from other anthropologists and others, his work engaging with varying cultures, and his late work, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, in 1973. Fromm was a great defender of universality. For Fromm, every human being is a microcosm of humanity itself as a macrocosm. The individual human being holds all psychological possibilities present in others. And the individual's greatest need is to accept the reality of individual freedom and responsibility while connecting in love to a wider whole, finding a home in the world. The human need for transcendence, as well, was met in part through unity with the whole, conceived as both humanity and the cosmos. Fromm's humanism was not an erasure of difference, but rather a pursuit of unity in difference, also a theme in Paulo Freire's pedagogy. Furthermore, according to Fromm, the individual is fulfilled through adopting the productive orientation, or relatedly, in the language of his later work, the being as opposed to having orientation. This was the psychological expression of the unalienated personality, rejecting capitalism's priority of things over people. Idolatry, in Fromm's terms, echoing Marx's critique of the commodity fetish. The individual creatively produces not merely commodities, but also fuller life and deeper relationships alongside artistic or scientific products, and is unbound from the alienation of capitalism. The pursuit of this productive orientation is expressed through conversational openness, impacting therapeutic practice and educational objectives. In the context of a discussion of education, Fromm writes, referencing dance, quote, "Man, in order to feel at home in the world, must grasp it not only with his head, but with all his senses, his eyes, his ears, with all his body. He must act out with his body what he thinks out with his brain. Body and mind cannot be separated in this or in any other aspect. If a man grasps the world and thus unites himself with it by thought, he creates philosophy, theology, myth, and science. If man expresses his grasp of the world by his senses, he creates art and ritual, he creates song, dance, drama, painting, sculpture." In his 1955 The Sane Society, from which the preceding quote comes, Fromm draws upon John Dewey in particular to explore the need for a form of education that merges the intellectual and vocational, as well as the need for collective ritual and aesthetic experience. Following Dewey, Fromm critiques the separation of art making into a specialized profession and invokes a need for ritual and collective art. Similar themes are reflected in an essay in Fromm's anthology Socialist Humanism, an International Symposium, by Dunham's friend, Negritude thinker and president of Senegal, Senghor. In the essay, Senghor classifies his thought as socialist but not Marxist, in part because he believes Marx underestimates the peasants in favor of the urban proletariat. However, he finds resonance with Marx's vision of human nature, particularly in relation to its creative function. For Marx, quote, Senghor writes, for Marx, man is essentially a producing artist. Recovering the arts must engage beyond dominant Soviet and Western sources, he argues, carrying Marx's conception of a liberated human nature through to its natural conclusion. Senghor seems to point towards the need for an international and creolizing art. As found, we might add in Dunham's dance, which has been called multilingual. Fromm also used the metaphor of dancing to describe his therapeutic work and to describe the open, alive, being mode of conversation. Fromm writes, while the having persons rely on what they have, the being persons rely on the fact that they are alive, and that something new will be born if only they have the courage to let go and respond. They come fully alive in the conversation because they do not stifle themselves by anxious concern with what they have. Their own aliveness is infectious and often helps the other person to transcend his or her egocentricity. Thus, the conversation ceases to be an exchange of commodities, information, knowledge, status, and becomes a dialogue in which it does not matter anymore who is right. The dualists begin to dance together, and they part not with triumph or sorrow, which are equally sterile, but with joy. Christian Fuchs refers to this as Fromm's humanistic organization of political communication. The wide-ranging education provided by Dunham's dance pedagogy is echoed in Fromm's therapeutic psychoanalytic approach, including the reading of philosophy with patience. Katherine Dunham's humanism. Although Fromm writes much on the various psychological mechanisms driving Nazism, he does not engage directly with the topic of race much in his writing. Dunham's humanism does not have this absence and also adds insight with regard to embodiment, which leaves us with a living archive, while leaving us a living archive in her students and those who carry on the tradition of Dunham technique in dance and the Dunham School. Although the word does not feature prominently for Dunham as it does for Fromm, the term humanism does appear in Dunham's work as a term with which she appears to identify. For example, in Island Possessed, while addressing her relationship with Haitian President Dumouriez Estime, she calls Estime a founder of negritude. Dunham writes, quote, "Negritude as nationalism swept Africans in Paris from the 1940s on and flourishes now as a plea for humanism, though so easily bordering on nationalism," end quote. In a December 1964 letter to Fromm, Dunham writes of having met with Senghor in Paris about the possibility of scholarships for Senegalese students at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Quote, "I had a long talk with Senghor, and of course he is anxious to meet you. His negritude bothers me. I told him I was sure it would before long include people with right thinking, not just black skins. He was more or less in accord. He seems much interested in Nasser, who now seems ready to enter the negritude ranks," end quote. It's not clear whether Dunham has the source. It is not clear whether Dunham was the source of Fromm's connection with Senghor and of Fromm's including him in Socialist Humanism and International Symposium. But Dunham's friendship with the only African participant in Fromm's volume is worth noticing. Locating Dunham's humanism is challenging, and one should be cautious of classifying her amidst debates in which she did not have a clear affiliation. There is debate about which thinkers belong to negritude, as well as nuance regarding its approach to the universal. While créolité has sometimes been contrasted with negritude as emphasizing hybridity rather than separateness, Soliman Diagne points out that negritude should not be dismissed as an essentialism of the past, but should be seen as continuing today in cosmopolitanism and creolization, rather than simply standing in opposition to these. As in Fromm, we find humanism and the creolizing tendency towards affirming and celebrating humanity as an ongoing process, in Monahan's terms, in Dunham's work. This includes in Dunham's work her anthropological method, her choreography, her philosophy of dance, and her innovation in dance pedagogy. First, Dunham's dance pedagogy, with its commitment to wide-ranging education, transcending mere technique, embodied her humanism. In 1944, she founded the Dunham School of Dance and Theater in New York City. Reflecting later, she said, "When I founded the Dunham School, the curriculum was often criticized. Why the teaching of the humanities, philosophy, language, aesthetics, as well as the Dunham technique? I believe these things are necessary for the complete person. And so to be the complete dancer, I could not simply teach dancing." End quote. Later in life, Dunham settled in East St. Louis, where she opened an arts center for Black youth. Dunham was concerned with the lack of hope in East St. Louis, telling the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, "I've been all over the world, and I've never known an area with so much apathy and less reason to hope." Dunham wanted her students in East St. Louis to, quote, "see themselves as part of a global interracial community." She brought the world to her students, in the words of Joanna D. Doss. She brought African and Caribbean culture by hiring drummers Zachariah Diouf and Mor Thiam of Senegal, sculptor Paul Osifo of Nigeria, dramatist Muthal Naidu of South Africa, and anthropologist Ina Campbell of Jamaica. She opened a museum and a center for intercultural communication to, in Dunham's words, lower the walls of fear and suspicion between individuals, groups, and cultures of every kind and in every place. What was this universalizing, humanizing function in the context of her school in East St. Louis? Joanna D. Doss sees Dunham's goal of socialization and humanization as shared with liberals in the Johnson administration and private foundations, and she presents Dunham as taking a more moderate approach for the time, forging a middle ground between Black power activists and liberal policymakers. Doss also notes that Dunham's center could not eliminate poverty, but reduced violence and gave participants richer, fuller lives. Doss's interpretation perhaps sees the crucial dichotomy of the moment as one between colorblind liberal reformism and Black identity politics, seeing the militant and pessimistic approaches as represented by activist youth in East St. Louis as inherently more radical than Dunham's cosmopolitan universalism. While there may be some truth in Dunham's position being more moderate, Doss perhaps places too much emphasis on Dunham's description of the project in grant applications, as these would be more likely read as a practical attempt to get money rather than a genuine manifesto. The statements in the grant application, which could be read as suggesting that the school would pacify unrest, also stand in contrast to her work for Black diasporic unity and her work on the Dunham technique as a pedagogy and a way of life. Doss notes that Dunham allowed the youth to store guns in her home and was arrested for her involvement supporting the youth. Classes at the Dunham School were always free, and the project can hardly be seen as apolitical. Dunham's dance pedagogy contributed to a long-term movement building and social transformation through the broadness of her educational approach. It also continued a tradition in dance that continues to unfold today, and her school in East St. Louis continues after her death. As Dunham-trained dance professor Ron Hudson told Tonya Sutherland, there's no question for me that Dunham's true archive is in her dancers' bodies. There's a transference of information from body to body that's very much like oral traditions. In addition to her pedagogy, Dunham's choreography has likewise been described as multilingual or as embodied bilingualism, a term originally developed by Danielle Robinson, who notes the mixing of Black and white dance elements in the ballroom dance of the Harlem Renaissance. According to Dunham, in her draft of a speech to the World Festival of Negro Arts in Senegal, dance is a social act through which individuals unite under a shared rhythm, as well as the rhythm of the cosmos itself as an unfolding creative process. Third, in her radical approach to anthropological research, including participant observation, going far beyond her contemporaries and undergoing initiation into Haitian voodoo in order to study it, Dunham wrestles with the tensions between belonging and outsiderness, finding both shared and different cultural threads, as well as some sense of universal humanity. Even the title of her most important book, Island Possessed, clearly expresses this complexity. She possesses, in her words, invades the island. The island itself is possessed by the spirits of ancestors and African or transatlantic gods, and Dunham herself is possessed by the island. She begins the book by describing herself as having invaded Haiti with her research, wrestling throughout the book in the ways she is both in and out of Haitian society, even as she chooses to undergo formal initiation into voodoo in the book's climax. Dancing for Dunham overcomes the tension between theory and practice, achieving to some extent what anthropology cannot. According to Marina Magliar, Dunham's book is caught between sincere yet embarrassing possession and rational yet cold scientific observation. In her travels in the Black diaspora, Dunham does not uncover some true African essence in herself. Marina Magloire emphasizes the difficulty in understanding and bridging cultures expressed by Dunham. Magloire points out that in Journey to Accompong, Dunham's book on her time in Jamaica studying Maroon culture, Dunham discusses how uncomfortable she feels and stays only a short time, joking a couple of weeks into her trip, "I wonder if this is what anthropologists call going native." The Jamaicans did not want to perform traditional dances for her and were more interested in listening to her jazz records. In Island Possessed, Dunham also experiences discomfort, as well as disgust, confusion, and embarrassment as she undergoes initiation into Haitian voodoo, and finds during the initiation ceremony a number of discomforts, lying on the ground for hours, another initiate urinating on her, and finding herself unable to eat a raw egg as part of the ceremony. Finally, after failing to complete a portion of the ritual, Dunham reflects, quote, "I have often wondered whether this decision was because of the never-ending quest for the novel, the statistics gathering of the researcher, or another reason which had troubled me, beginning as a doubt and developing into a full-grown suspicion. I was, in short, not at all sure of my sincerity in these pursuits, and there seemed to be no way to put myself to the test to find out. Could Herskovits tell me? Could Erich Fromm? Could Theoline or de Grasse tell me what part of me lived on the floor of the Hung For, felt awareness seeping from the earth and people and things around me, and what part stood to one side taking notes? Each moment lived in participation was real. Still, without arranging this expressly, without conscious doing or planning or thinking, I stayed outside the experience while being totally immersed in it. I can now observe with some pity, even amusement, the newly traveled, ethnic-saturated, homesick for Chicago Iphigenia, wondering what next to do to prove herself a scientist to her alma mater, the true scholar to her country, the selfless sacrificial maiden to her people." According to Magloire, Dunham makes discomfort an ethic, something an outsider to any culture should feel. Discomfort enables her to maintain the reality of her distinct context, but also to meet and share in a common experience. In short, quote, "Dunham tried to have it all, discomfort and belonging, universalism and nuance." According to Dunham's philosophy of dance, a fourth key node of Dunham's humanism, dance can unite individuals across racial lines, and even with the cosmos itself, in its motion of coming to be and unfolding. By dancing, one participates in this cosmic choreography. Dunham believed that shared rhythm could transcend racial division. In fact, Dunham also suggested that one of the survival mechanisms in Black people has been a rhythmic pattern that relates more to universal rhythmic patterns. There was a vastness and placelessness within her dance education that nevertheless combined, creolized, and advanced a variety of forms, including by uplifting a wide variety of Black dance traditions. Speaking of her educational method, and sounding very much like Fromm, she said, "If people could only understand they belong to a much vaster society than they live in, this would give them courage to live life with less fear of death. A bit of the whole is in everybody. You take your participation in the total." Dance has, according to Dunham, a vital function in meeting man's natural needs to communicate. Dunham writes, quote, "The emotional life of any community is clearly legible in its art forms. And because the dance seeks continuously to capture moments of life in a fusion of time, space, and motion, the dance is at a given moment the most accurate chronicler of cultural pattern. Alone or in concert, man dances his various selves, and his emotions and his dance become a communication as clear as though it were written or spoken in a universal language. Well, a complete union with the other is not possible. The researcher must in some sense stand to one side taking notes. Dunham also finds possibilities for the participation in the total, including through the embodied practice of dance. Conclusion. By creolizing, Fromm and Dunham arrive at the universal in their theories and their lives. The specificities of located encounter were embedded in a wider humanistic project. Travel and shifting in habitation, for Dunham with an ethic of discomfort, provided opportunities for each to arrive at a more expansive humanism and transcend the boundaries of home. While humanist philosophies always risk exclusion, the exploration of humanism's potentiality exists within it and not only outside. For Fromm and Dunham, the wider spatial world opened up possibilities of both individuation and community, and offered hope for emancipation. To encounter this fully, the self needed to be encountered not only theoretically, but also practically, within a deeper aliveness, a deeper productiveness, in Fromm's term, or embodied expression through dance, for Dunham, providing unity both with humanity and the cosmos. Could a new home in the world thus be found for critical theorists and activists today? Perhaps this is ultimately encountered more through a form of experience than adherence to a set of claims, and more through unity with a human process than identification of fixed categories. Through their own embodied experience united with their thought, Fromm and Dunham touched the universal. Yet we should balance this with self-reflection and awareness. From Dunham's anthropological method, we are offered this hope of union alongside the need for an ethic of discomfort. While we may never fully arrive in our new universal home, glimpses of it appear to us in the present. The story of Dunham and Fromm remains to be fully told. It is a mark of the specialization of knowledge, as well as the dominant white frame of the academy, that this intersection is so underexplored. To further creolize critical theory and keep critical theory critical and infused with emancipatory intent, we must encounter new spaces and recover, in the words of Susan Buck-Morse, undisciplined stories. Fromm's and Dunham's own lives are a testament to the possibilities that emerge from refusing disciplinary as well as spatial confinement.